The following podcast is non-profit and is based on the IGCSE history curriculum. Hello listeners, in this week's episode I'll be speaking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, which took place in 1962 and mainly involved the USA, USSR and Cuba. Cuba became communist after Fidel Castro led a communist revolution in 1959 and Castro took control of all American property. As a result, the USA imposed economic sanctions, so Cuba established friendly relations with the USSR and began trading with them instead. President John F. Kennedy used Cuban exiles to try and invade the country. This was known as the Bay of Pigs invasion, and it was a humiliating failure for Kennedy. Castro asked the USSR for help in case America invaded again, so Khrushchev began to secretly place Soviet missiles in Cuba, hoping that this would discourage another US invasion, and he believed that he may be able to use these missiles as a bargaining chip to persuade the US to remove NATO missiles in Turkey. A U-2 spy plane photographed the missiles in Cuba. Hawks within the US Army and XCOM urged Kennedy to launch surgical airstrikes on Cuba, but Kennedy decided to set up a naval blockade instead, telling Khrushchev to remove the missiles or risk war. Khrushchev announced that Soviet ships would break through the US blockade. He stated that the USSR was willing to use nuclear weapons if war began. Kennedy rose the US military alert to DEFCON 2 so they were prepared for war. Khrushchev then wrote two letters to Kennedy. The first said that he would remove the missiles in Cuba if Kennedy promised not to invade Cuba. The second said that NATO missiles must be removed from Turkey as part of the deal. Publicly, Kennedy agreed to the demands of Khrushchev's first letter. However, in secret, he sent his brother, Robert Kennedy, to tell the Soviet ambassador to the United States that he would remove the missiles in Turkey if the agreement was kept a secret. Khrushchev agreed to this deal and then removed the missiles from Cuba. Nuclear war had been averted. In some ways, Khrushchev gained from the crisis. Firstly, to the Soviet people, he looked like a responsible peacemaker as he had turned Soviet ships around to avoid war. Secondly, he had protected Cuba from another US invasion and maintained a valuable communist ally in the Americas. Cuba further supported many other communist revolutionaries in Central and South America. Thirdly, American missiles were removed from Turkey, which upset NATO allies, as they were not consulted about this decision. In some ways, Kennedy gained from the crisis. Firstly, the USSR had been forced to back down and remove missiles from Cuba. This made Khrushchev look weak, and he was later removed from power in 1964. Secondly, although the USA had removed the missiles from Turkey, it was done secretly, so Kennedy still looked strong publicly. Also, the development of ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, made the missiles in Cuba obsolete as they could be fired from the US. Other consequences included 1. Castro was upset by the removal of missiles from Cuba, but he needed the Soviet Union as an ally. He maintained control over Cuba and kept control of American companies. 2. The crisis showed how brinkmanship had almost led to nuclear war. The USA and the USSR began to try and reduce conflicts between them, including setting up a special telephone hotline between Washington and Moscow to allow issues to be solved peacefully. This is the end of this week's episode. Please consider subscribing to the podcast to be notified when I upload next. Also, you could use some of the links in the description of my podcasts to either submit a voice message to me, which I'll reply in my next episode, to submit feedback about the podcast, or to visit my website to look at some more revision material. Thank you for listening.